Thank you so much for being here. My name is Julianne McCall. I'm the CEO of the California Council on Science and Technology, CCST. And as has come up in numerous conversations over the last 2 days, California, shows again and again how we continue to be at the front lines of these climate change-fueled disasters, as well as the responses to those disasters. At the same time, a changing federal landscape, is adding not just one layer of complexity, but multiple in so many directions, that it provides an unsolicited window, to exert our leadership ever more for the wider global community and not just our national community. Sustaining California's leadership in climate change and policy, continues to require strong cross-collaborations among researchers, industry leaders, communities, particularly those at the front lines, living through these disasters and communicating back to policymakers where the priorities and the opportunities lie. So we have an amazing set of panelists, the type of people who really give you hope for our future, who are eager to dive into this discussion. So as I introduce each of you one at a time, I'd like to invite you to set the scene for our audience, describe your top priorities for climate action, and highlight any key partnerships that will help advance these priorities, knowing full well you have an audience of several hundred here in this room as well as online, ready to jump in and board this train of policy action, California at the lead. So I will start with Director Sam Assefa of the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovations, formerly known as the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. This office is dedicated to creating economies, built environments, and policies that are beneficial to all Californians. Director Assefa has served in various urban planning roles throughout the country, including for the city of Seattle, the city of Chicago, the city of Boulder, and the city of San Francisco. Director Assefa, I invite you to provide 2 to 3 minutes of opening remarks.
Great, thank you, Julianne. And all those cities you mentioned, it just shows how old I am. I've been around for quite some time. Thank you, CU and CCST. This is an important gathering and conversation, and certainly a timely conversation in the context of not only climate change, but of course our political environments that we find ourselves in as well. As Julianne mentioned, LCI, that used to be OPR, was restructured a year ago. First time since 1970. The office was created by a Republican governor, Ronald Reagan, right after the most stringent environmental law was enacted in California, CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. So this office was created to administer that program, but also be the state's land use agency, research, innovation. 1970. Well, Governor Newsom wanted to make it even more relevant to the times that we're in, and as a result, we restructured the office to kind of go back to the future, but also emphasize the importance of land use and climate. And those are interconnected with the economy and everything else. So with that context, a lot of the priorities that the office is currently advancing is what the governor is prioritizing and has been prioritizing since he's been governor. And these are sort of really addressing the existential threat that we have around climate and how we respond to that based on science. And it's a state that truly believes in science, as is his administration. And how we really focus on who are the most impacted by it and how do we prepare the state and communities around that. So some of the key priorities are really what does resiliency means in terms of preparing for, responding to, and recovering from significant disasters from climate change. As we know, everybody knows, now you can see that on a pretty much a daily basis in California. I think we're in the front lines of the impacts of climate change. So a lot of the priorities really focus on how do we prepare for that and respond to. There is significant amount of focus, as I mentioned, on the most impacted are the ones that I think we need to have priorities for. Again, we see it repeatedly, whether it's in LA or any other disasters. So we're focusing on that. Of course, housing in California is a critical need, but we're also connecting the dots as housing as a climate strategy. A number of our programs, Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, is a really good pilot, innovative program that has now sort of matured. It really connects the dots all across at the regional level and at the local level, and focuses again on people who are impacted should be part of the solution in policies and programs that they create. So a number of the work in that area, or the fifth climate assessments, all of those focus on cross-collaboration, bottoms-up, and science-based solutions, as well as lived experience solutions to some of the challenges that we face in climate. So those are sort of high-level priorities for us.
Thank you so much, Director Assefa. Next on the panel, we have Secretary Yana Garcia, Secretary of Environmental Protection, heading up the CalEPA. Secretary Garcia was appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom in 2022, building on an accomplished career as an environmental leader and an environmental lawyer. CalEPA's mission includes the restoration, protection, and enhancement of the environment. We are so lucky to have you here with us today. If you'd like to take a few minutes to provide your priorities as well. Thank you, Senator.
Sure. Hi. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. A pivotal moment for sure in terms of what we're all grappling with. I think many of you can hear the howling winds and rain, and many of us, and I'm sure many of you as well, have seen firsthand the devastation from the Los Angeles wildfires earlier this month, or last month that is, in January. And so I think I'll talk a little bit about some of our priorities, particularly as they relate to what we're seeing play out in terms of the real-time resiliency that is needed for the state. Certainly we are on the front lines and experiencing the climate crisis in real time. First and foremost, within CalEPA through the work of the Air Resources Board, but also across all of our boards and departments, we are laser focused on achieving carbon neutrality by 2045, but we know that that's not enough. Achieving carbon neutrality by 2045 is certainly a good goal to have, especially as we're losing traction at the federal level in terms of having similar or even close to similar targets to achieve the same. But we also know that our communities deserve better in terms of air quality. And as we get to 2045, it's incumbent on us to make sure that we are equally focused on improving air quality in the many basins across California that still struggle with poor air quality. And that includes areas in the Central Valley, in places like Kern County and Bakersfield, where air quality issues range from pesticide drift to particulate matter to air quality impacts from oil and gas extraction, to the Los Angeles basin that is impacted by heavy duty trucks and truck traffic, in addition to vehicle emissions, as well as now by wildfires, which we're seeing intermittently throughout the year. There is now no such thing as a wildfire season here in California, unfortunately. And it's no coincidence that these wildfires are hitting at a time in which we are experiencing the highest temperatures on record globally. That is a direct correlation there. And there's also a lot to be said for the land use practices that we've seen all across our state and what those mean for communities and ecosystems that have long had a very interesting and different relationship with fire, including in Southern California. And this is why we're equally as focused on ensuring that equity underlies so much of our work. And that means in focusing on how our work impacts the most vulnerable, but also how we are incorporating solutions from people who have long had the solutions and have been ignored. That includes things like cultural burning. It includes ways to steward our lands that have been applied since time immemorial. The second sort of category of priorities that we have that also has to do with the Los Angeles fires is that by 2040, we're looking at a 10% decrease in our water supply. And that is certainly an impact of climate change. And it is also, again, incumbent on us to ensure that we are doing everything we can to diversify our water supply, to ensure that our communities have backup water supplies for those moments where drought has hit. Again, hottest years on record, hottest temperatures on records, and lowest water tables in terms of groundwater supply. Surface water supply, we have plenty of. We have a lot of that moving forward, but we need to make sure that we are able to replenish our water supplies for our communities and for all uses. And I'll save the rest for the questions to come, but thanks again for having us and look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you so much, Secretary Garcia. Next on the panel, we have Senator Ben Allen representing the Senate, the 24th Senate District, encompassing Los Angeles South Side, West Side, South Bay, and the Santa Monica Mountains. And if I'm not mistaken, part of the Palisades Fire area. Senator Allen is now serving his third term. He was initially elected in 2014 and serves as the chair of the Senate Budget Subcommittee on Resources, Environmental Protection, and Energy. He was previously the chair of the Senate Committee on Environmental Quality, pardon me. Senator Allen, it's such an honor to have you here, and would love for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you so much, and it's so great to see everyone. Many of us celebrated last night our wonderful fellows in the CCST program in general. Our committee oversees the budget of much of the work that's been described here, our climate policies, our energy policies, our natural resources. We, of course, as was mentioned, have been seeing the massive whipsaw of climate change, and I do represent the Palisades. It's just been a really, really rough month, quite frankly. A lot of my friends have lost their homes. We're now deep into the very difficult process of cleanup and starting to think about rebuilding, what that looks like. But it's going to be a long and arduous process, and people have moved from the shock phase to the anger phase. And so we're getting a lot of the incoming associated with that. But it's just another example of why we are also committed to doing what we can to fight climate change and also make our state more resilient. It's part of course, why for years I was pushing for a climate bond. We finally got Prop 4 passed last year, a $10 billion bond that will put in some very important upfront investments in so many of the areas that we've been talking about today: water resiliency and our water infrastructure, fire resiliency, and a number of other important areas, including biodiversity, 30 by 30, land preservation, some clean energy infrastructure, et cetera. So it's going to be a very important effort. It also has an equity lens. At least 40% of the money has to go to underserved communities. And so that work will be happening at our budget committee. In addition, we'll be overseeing the fire fighting efforts moving forward and recovery efforts, which of course are going to be intense. We're looking at some sort of climate smart rebuild. How do we rebuild in a way that will learn the lessons of the past and not just make all the same mistakes we've made in the past? And what sort of regulations should we be waiving as we try to get the communities back online and try to get them rebuilt as fast as possible? We want to make sure this is expedited and cost effective, but we also want to make sure we're being smart. The committee is also going to oversee the cap and trade extension and the greenhouse gas reduction fund. And what sort of lessons are there to be learned both from the past? Has the program worked as designed? Yes and no. What can we learn from places like Washington that just was able to survive a $100 million, some massive spend by the oil industry trying to fight the cap and invest program that they passed there? And one thing they found is that up in Washington, they really focused on programs that were climate smart, but also smart for people's pocketbooks, that people could really feel. Free transit for young people and older people, vouchers for insulation and home hardening, so people could both reduce their energy bills while also being good for the environment. So those kinds of things that people really felt, not just giveaways to various powerful interest groups up here, up in the state capitol, but things that really helped impact affordability on the ground with regular folks. These are the kinds of things that we're looking at. We really do rely on the thoughtful research that's provided by our universities and by CCST and the University of California, of course, and the partnership that we have with them. One of the things I just failed to mention last night that I really do, I want to emphasize with regards to my deep respect for the council, is that we've got the world of politics and government and the world of science are both enormously important, and yet it seems as though sometimes we speak different languages. And CCST stands right between the two, translating for both communities and ensuring that we engage in real, meaningful, powerful, effective dialogue so that we can help move forward a science-based, data-based, research-based agenda that will truly benefit our state. And for that, and for many other reasons, I just want to reiterate my deep respect and gratitude for the work of the council.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Senator Allen. And if you missed our reception and award ceremony, Senator Allen is the recipient of the 2025 CCST Science and Public Service Award for the state government. So congratulations again, and thank you. It's no curiosity. Last but certainly not least, Executive Director of the University of California Natural Reserve System, Dr. Steve Monfort, is here on the panel as well, overseeing an agency that is providing protection to over 50,000 acres spread across 42 reserves within the system. Their mission is to advance the understanding and stewardship of the Earth and its natural systems by supporting teaching, research, and public service, protecting natural areas throughout California. Prior to joining the University of California, he was director of the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, as well as the National Zoo. Such an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm representing the University of California. You've seen a lot of the work of my colleagues over the last day and a half, and it's really incredible. But I represent a particular part of the university, and it's University of California Natural Reserve System. And we were established in 1965, and today we're the largest system of nature-based field stations in the world, with 42 sites representing all of the major ecosystems of the state of California. We support research. We're a platform, basically, for research of all different kinds. We're accessible to the University of California, but all folks around the world with the legitimate use to come and use our facilities for research or education. But in general, we do research that is aimed at understanding nature, and in particular, the impacts of climate change on nature. And also, we work on trying to and make sure that we're training the next generation of leaders and environmental literate citizens and scientists. We are also a trustee agency. We're one of only four. We're the State Lands Commission, CDFW, and state parks. And that means we have a responsibility to steward our lands on behalf of the people of California. I think that one of the most important things that we're leaning into, and it's more important than ever, given the news lately about reductions in DEI and so on, we feel very, very strongly that we need to provide increased access to nature-based education as much as we possibly can. We feel it's important to uplift climate-vulnerable communities, first-gen students, and underrepresented groups, because the conservation community, the biodiversity community, looks too much like myself and is not diverse enough, and that needs to be strengthened. Overall, I think our goal is to have students come to us and ultimately understand the intrinsic value of nature, and that they will take that with them in whatever sector of society they find themselves in, so that all people will understand the value that we have. Finally, we're involved in we're distributed in a way that gives us a unique footprint around the state where we can assess, we hope, biodiversity in a way that will be useful to the state. And we're partnered very closely with CDFW in building out a very exciting program that I'll talk a bit about later in another question, I hope. So anyway, very excited to be here, and partnering with the state is super important for us.
Thank you so much. California is so incredibly lucky. So to start out our questions, and I encourage you over the next 45 minutes while we have an on-stage conversation, for you to note your questions, as we'll open it up at least for the last 20 minutes for questions from the audience. And standard by this point, right, to line up at the microphone to your right, and I'll take the questions one by one. But to start us out, we'd really love to know just the practical view of where the successes are, which your agency has contributed, or what you have seen from the legislative perspective, Senator Allen, or what you have seen, Dr. Monfort, from the academic side of things. Where has cross-sector collaboration for climate change action been successful, and what were the main drivers of that success?
I'll go. I think top on that list is cross-sector collaboration. There's no substitute to that for a couple of reasons. One, as we're learning more and more, even here in California, climate change is such a complex issue that touches almost every aspect of not only life, but infrastructure, people, community, and all of the above. So a lot of the successes, so in my own office, some of the big successes were sort of pilot programs that are developed, such as the Transformative Climate Communities Program under the Strategic Growth Council. This is a council that represents 7 state agency secretaries. My friend Yana is on it, as well as I am. So that cross-agency led but community-driven on the ground solutions through the TCC has been one of the most successful pilots that now we're focusing on scaling it up. It was so successful, in fact, on the Biden-Harris bipartisan infrastructure bill. It was a model for about a $3 billion investment that was put in that bill because of the success of programs such as TCC. And this flexible structure, like the SGC within LCI, affords us to actually pilot programs. And some of the success is not just because local, on the ground, people most impacted are actually charting the solutions for them. We just enable them through funds, but they come up with the solutions. But it also forces cross-collaboration. So a lot of programs in our office focus on advancing that. The ICARP I mentioned, Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program. It focuses grants at the regional level and at the local level. Both are important. Each one of them require multi-sectoral collaboration and engagement. The 5th climate assessment, we're out there, I will be out there for the next year, engaging at the local level to really build that collaboration. It's not just about pure science, it's also, I mentioned, lived experiences from our tribal partners to really understand 10,000 years of land stewardship. How do we incorporate that into our science and inform our 5th assessment? So we have new science, but it's informed by those kinds of cross-sectoral collaboration. So those are some of the successes that I see from government programs such as ones taking place in my office.
I'll just add very quickly, it's very well put by the director. I think we've done a lot of historical sort of sectoral siloing of climate work in the past that has taken us a bit of time to untangle. And I think we're making some pretty good progress in that respect over the past few years. And certainly a lot of that has been housed through local government collaboratives and through the Strategic Growth Council and the great work there in pulling together folks who are interested in transit access, housing, as well as climate resilience and climate mitigation. So I think much of the progress that we still have to make going forward to ensure that we're really catalyzing that work and ensuring that it can move forward successfully is really thinking through how we are going to deal with sites like cleanup sites. And I say this in relation to historical cleanup sites, but also even in the face again of the wildfires that we've just seen, largest urban wildfires we have had in the state of California in history, but how we are going to marry the equal priorities of moving swiftly and streamlining permitting while we are ensuring safety and environmental stewardship and ensuring that generations to come are not burdened with the toxics that could be remaining from much of what we use every day. And so I think one of the areas that I'm most excited about continuing to explore is a true cross-sector partnership where we can work hand in hand to remediate and test soils while we are moving forward swiftly to rebuild and recover, but that we are not losing sight of the need to maintain a focus on human safety and well-being and health as we are moving toward creating the housing that we need, the transit access that we need, et cetera. One last kind of cross-sectoral partnership that I think is really important and worth mentioning that is probably obvious to any of you who engage in environmental justice work is that of environmental activists and climate activists and labor. And in particular, we're seeing in certain places in the Inland Empire as well as in South LA, areas where warehouse workers and truckers are coming to the table with environmental advocates to really push for the acceleration, notwithstanding federal government moving away from their commitments or from our collective commitments, but pushing for the acceleration of zero-emission vehicle deployment. From the standpoint of worker health and safety, from the standpoint of job fulfillment, and from the standpoint of community safety and environmental justice, as well as climate justice.
I would just answer the question by pulling a little bit more macro. All this great work that's been described has helped to lead something to something that's really rather extraordinary, which is that the United States emissions growth is flatlined, which is a really extraordinary thing. We all know we need to go much lower. We know this is absolutely inadequate. But if you actually think about how fierce the headwinds are, political, financial, social, cultural, the fact that we've been able to stanch that growth in emissions, fighting against some of the most powerful industries who had so much at stake in growing emissions, is really amazing at the national level. And of course, we know that so much of that's been driven by us here in California, not just our efforts at reducing emissions here in the state, but also helping to pilot and drive and ultimately scale the cutting edge technologies that are helping the rest of the country, and indeed the rest of the world, cut back on their emissions. And that's because of all the hard work that we've all been doing together on the policy side, everything from cap and trade, which really is a cross-sectoral effort. You have a lot of people in industry that want to see it reauthorized, which is an extraordinary thing. Makes you wonder whether it needs to be stronger in various respects. But still, the fact that there's so much buy-in from various people on the industry side actually shows how big tent we've been, and it actually has showed results. In a smaller example that Yana knows well, and Sam too, I've been working very closely on circular economy issues, plastics reduction, and one of the things we've been working on is got big SB 54 done a couple of years ago, which creates this extended producer responsibility system, which puts the producers in the driver's seat, but then holds them accountable for the hard work, but the important work of reducing all of this additional plastic waste that is both a climate driver and also a massive pollution and waste driver. And that was ultimately the result of a complicated but successful negotiation between local government, environmental organizations, environmental justice voices, and industry. And it's an example of how when we show resolve, we really can bring people together. I think it's when people think, when they smell some blood in the water and they think that they can, when they question our resolve, then that can detract from a successful negotiation. But one of the things we were able to do there was show strength, bring all the parties to the table, and ultimately get a really important measure through that's helping to drive global markets with regards to sustainable alternatives for products and packaging. And so that's another example that I'm proud of.
Well, I'd like to point to an example that relates to 30 by 30 and a great partnership that we're developing with the state, with California Department of Fish and Wildlife. When you think about things like fires and drought, sea level rise, these are all things that you can see and you can react to, and you know that they're related, driven by climate change, for example. But when you think about biodiversity and ecosystem collapse, it's a hidden or pernicious type of an event that's very difficult to document in real time. And yet we have early warning systems for fire, like Alert Wildfire, California. We don't have an early warning system for biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. And we need such a system if we want to know whether what we're doing, the interventions we're taking, are actually working as we intend. And so my day job, I work for the UC, and I also am the chairman of the California Biodiversity Network, which is about a 900-person strong community of practice where stewards and scientists and practitioners from around the state are all working to help support the state in achieving 30 by 30. And one of the goals of that group is to establish a statewide climate biodiversity sentinel site network, where we could assess biodiversity at scales from regional to statewide levels in near real time. And so, why is this important? And if you think about, currently we don't possess a mechanism for assessing biodiversity on lands that are set aside and counted for 30 by 30, or for complementary lands, for example. And so it's important that we can develop a system that will tell us whether or not what we're doing works or not. So if you think about the mechanism, we're talking about partnering together with, well, if you don't have that, so how do you know whether the lands that you're setting aside are performing as you intended? Or even if the 30 by 30 concept writ large is even works as we planned it to work. So we need to have that data to be able to understand what our baseline is. When you don't know what your baseline is, and you have a massive fire or a catastrophe, we can't tell you what you lost. And we can't also tell you what might likely recover. And so this is fundamental data. Bottom line, if you don't know what you have to start with, how are you going to measure your success moving forward? So the solution, we think, one of the solutions to this is taking our 42 sites, as well as 40 sites that CDFW has set aside. Each of those sites is instrumented with a scientific-grade weather system and environmental sensors. And then what we're doing is we're using a protocol developed at CDFW through their cannabis program that uses camera traps and acoustic recorders to look at bats and birds, mammals, and reptiles. And within about a year from now, we are standing this up now. We will have 90 sites, and we'll have 300 of these monitoring arrays that are all collecting the same data at the same time in the same way to demonstrate that we can function at scale to assess biodiversity. And so this is, once we have that proof of concept, we can start to layer on all kinds of additional information. We can use eDNA and DNA barcoding and genomics and aerial and satellite-based remote sensing technologies and all kinds of other sensors that can be put in there. We can use these not just on 30 by 30 lands, but we'll use them on complementary lands to look at where corridors might exist or whether we might be adding lands. This could help us to make decisions about the next 5 million acres that we still need to add. So we feel this is, it's a way to go forward to create essentially an ecological observatory that can help inform the state in real time about what is the status of biodiversity in California. We have all of the tools already exist. What we're talking about is aggregating these tools in a new way through a multi-jurisdictional partnership network. Ultimately, we'll have to feed all this into data platforms that can be used for analysis and synthesis in ways that we don't even yet know. But we have to start collecting these data. If AI models need to ingest accurate data, we need to be providing that data so we can make better decisions. I think the real problem is monitoring is not very sexy. It's difficult to fund. And so we can do this. The question is, can we sustain it with long-term funding for the benefit of the state?
Thank you so much. And if not government, then who? Particularly on topics like this. So looking ahead, within California's efforts to advance climate change action, what changes do you anticipate with the new federal leadership and changed priorities?
Well, some of them are obvious, from one, denial, and then the other, funding. But what is really true, and what is also remarkable, why this state is unique, is regardless of that, this state will continue to lead on those issues. I think that's not even questionable. We have been here before, in 2016, and California led, whether it's the legislature or the governor, and that one, doubling down in our own state policies, and that is happening as we speak now. Second, of course, you have to look at partnerships and other creative financing solutions. Third, and I think most importantly, you keep building coalitions. In the last change during the administration, California led building the US Climate Coalition, 24 governors around the country who committed to net zero by 2040, I believe, or 45. These are 24 governors. They represent 66% of US economy. California also led and participated in what is called the Under 2 Coalition internationally, the largest collection of subnationals who are committed to net zero by 2050. That's worldwide, and California sits as a steering in the steering committee now for that. So this state continues to lead on that, regardless of what federal policies, oscillate. That's what's comforting. I started my talk saying the most stringent climate policy was enacted under a Republican governor, and many other Republican governors since then have actually supported and led on climate issues. So of course, realistic, we'll have funding and other misinformation and all that we have to continuously fight. But the underlying, I think, comfort that I have is, at least as far as California is concerned, that leadership will continue. And you should have seen some of us at COP29 in Baku. The rest of the world was actually constantly looking to California, asking the same question, would California continue its leadership now that, we have changes in the federal government? So that's, not only my perspective, I think a number of us within at least state government.
Yeah, so we've been here before. We had this experience under the first Trump administration. There are some distinctions that are better prepared, good for them this time around. I think the main message that is important for us to all keep in mind, to Ben's point on the resolve that we have, we're not going away, and our climate commitments are not going away. We have one of the most, again, ambitious plans to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. Our state scoping plan acts as a nationally determined contribution plan internationally. We are still the 5th largest economy in the world. That the significance of that plan is huge, and that is not going away by any means. I think the other resounding point that Ben mentioned in terms of our cap and trade program is that the mechanisms in which we get to where we need to be are also built with buy-in that is broad and certainly includes industry actors, significant industry actors all across our state and globally. And they're also not going away. And that commitment, we hope, is not going to change. We have private partnerships in a wide array of our work, including, of course, in the circular economy, not only when it comes to dealing with plastics and extended producer responsibilities there, but also increasingly now in the textile industry, 2 key industries that we need to decarbonize in order to meet our carbon neutrality targets, but also to build a more sustainable system, a circular system where each product actually has an additional use before the end of its life. And so I think we're making really good headway there. The Air Resources Board and the state have reached agreements with the largest truck manufacturers in the world, with Airlines for America, to increase the sustainable aviation fuel access across mostly interstate flights, but that is progress as well. And we're also working in public-private partnership in Arches to build out hydrogen facilities, which many of you all know, and all of that work, again, is certainly not going away. And I think it also bears mentioning that our focus on environmental justice and equity is likewise not going away. That is also built into the very fabric of our programs. There is not a single climate funding program that can be passed in our legislature that does not have a significant proportion for disadvantaged communities. We have really moved the needle in that respect as a state. We saw under the Biden administration that the federal government adopted so much of the work that we did in California to develop tools like CalEnviroscreen, to identify areas that need more investment and to create that investment there. Those areas are often in red districts just as much as they're in blue districts. And so I think that sort of tethering to the very network that makes us California is not going to go away either. And we stand by the importance of that work. We will continue to do the good work. Our team knows very well that it's time to roll up our sleeves and continue the work that we do day in and day out. I will not sugarcoat the fact that there are challenges ahead, and there will continue to be, but make no mistake that we remain committed to certainly achieving carbon neutrality and delivering real benefits for our communities, especially those that need it most.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I just want to focus a little bit on what sort of lessons we might want to learn from the election results. And I guess just really ask that as we all do this vitally important work in advancing our climate agenda and our environmental goals, that we keep affordability and the impacts on real folks in mind, and really focus on benefits for everyday Americans. And so as you're thinking about the technology that you work on, the research that you do, please think with that lens. How do we make these kinds of technologies that are going to change the world for the better, truly affordable, truly accessible to working people? And I think, unfortunately, partly because of a very well-funded disinformation campaign and a lot of other things, but the environmental agenda has been attacked very successfully by a lot of folks who don't want to see it succeed. And it's been done on the grounds that it's elitist, that it doesn't care about working people, that it's just pricing people out of a happy life. And I think that all of us together have to figure out ways to push back on that narrative, not only on the messaging side, but more importantly on the substance side. How do the technologies that folks here are working on, how does the research translate to working Americans? And I just want to throw that out there for us to contemplate.
I would take it from the point of view of the international community is through the Kunming, Montreal Global Biodiversity Targets. California has signed on to that. The world is looking to California to continue to do the work that we're doing with respect to making progress in terms of conserving biodiversity and responding to climate change. And so there's a consensus that we need information about biodiversity so that we can make better decisions. There's a need for those protocols. They're looking to California as a model for how do you implement something like 30 by 30. So I think we have to keep our eye on the ball going forward. I think of it this way. I'm not a young guy. I started out my career, wanting to save the world and conserve species, biodiversity. And here I am, and I realize now that the problems that we're trying to solve are kind of forever problems. And these aren't going to be solved in my generation or my career. And so we have to create these knowledge bridges between successive generations that will ensure that the work that we're doing will not be lost. We can't be canceled. We won't be canceled because knowledge is power, and that's going to prevail in the long run. I also managed a government entity during the last Trump administration. This is something that we cannot be distracted by. It's too important. California is too important of a model here to fail. So we're just going to keep going. I know I'm shared that with all of my colleagues. I don't care what they say. We're going to keep going. Knowledge and science is going to tell us the right answers, and that's going to guide us in the future to make the right decisions for all mankind.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So magic wand territory. What are the gaps that you see that you would have filled, whether they're resources, whether it's capacity, whether it's knowledge, right? The gaps that currently exist that may hinder California from maintaining its leadership position in climate change action and or research as well. And around that theme, the opportunities and the challenges of pursuing those. Would you like to start? No pressure.
Well, first of all, there are always challenges, but the top ones, I think, well, first let me say, it still won't hinder California's leadership in that area. But obviously, financing and money is an issue. Whatever climate we're in politically, what we know is the scale, intensity of climate change, the frequency and all that, it's very hard to keep up with how much resources you need to combat that. So one is funding. Second, capacity, at least from where I sit, where we engage with local jurisdictions statewide, not every part of California is equal. So there are some jurisdictions who have absolutely zero resources, even to get the science and the technology that they need to be resilient or sustainable within their own counties. So capacity is a critical part of that gap. And then the third one is data and information. I think this is why engagement, Science Week, is so critical in some of the conversations earlier, where the gaps are in terms of what we need to look at from the science. And the reason that data is always going to be challenging is, again, the climate is changing not only so fast. We're having, extreme rain, extreme flood, extreme drought, extreme fire, and then they go in cycles. We don't know the cumulative impact of that, whether on biodiversity or any other impact. Those are gaps in data that we, like Fifth Assessment, is trying to address, as well as some of the research that we need to look at. So data, capacity, money, regardless of where we are. Those are, I think, the key challenges that I see.
I'll say quickly, I think less than a gap, it's, I see a need for integration. So, Ben rightly said, making technologies affordable and thinking about with every new innovation, everything that we're kind of developing for the future, that we think about it in terms of what can be affordable and accessible and easily disseminated. And we're seeing a lot of this when it comes to some of the work that we're doing to diversify our water supply, as I mentioned, where we released a regulation last year on direct potable reuse. Extraordinarily expensive technologies for direct potable reuse for those of you who engage in any water recycling work. We need to make that type of technology more accessible. We're trying to move away from chemical-based pesticide products. This has benefits for the health of our ecosystems, for biodiversity, for groundwater recharge, but we can't get the integrated approaches that we need as easily as we want to be able to deploy them at scale. And so those are the types of things that I see as less of a gap, but more of an absence of integration, of an understanding that with every action there can be equal co-benefits in so many areas. And if we do not have that full picture in mind, then we're not really doing the work of ensuring that we're addressing all of these things. Another example is how the cost of living increasing can also drive up VMT, because you have vehicle miles traveled every day and drive up your carbon dioxide emissions. I mean, all of these things we know, but we continue, I think, to to develop solutions that aren't necessarily developed with the whole picture in mind. So if I were to identify any one gap, it would be that, the sort of integrated approach, because we are out of time to continue to work on just one piece at a time. And we need to really think about the holistic picture.
Yeah, I think our barriers, we've got innovation and infrastructure, and then politics. On the infrastructure side, we have so much further to go on charging infrastructure for the electrification process, smart grid technology, energy storage, and batteries, improving our public. Those are some of the higher tech things, but also things that are age old. How do we improve our public transit systems to make it more safe and rideable and truly user friendly? So we don't even have to worry about the strains of the EV system on the charging infrastructure. So all those kinds of questions I think are looming large as we try to transition to a more electrified energy economy here in the state of California. And I've kind of struggled with it a little personally, having just purchased an EV, and now you want to go on a little bit of a trip. You really gotta think twice about what you do and how you plan and where you have. And I've learned some of the inefficiencies and deficiencies of our charging infrastructure the hard way. So those are some things I think we need to spend some time on. And then of course politics, as we talked about affordability. We talked about the good news from Washington, right? The fact that a focus on things that people can see, that's tangible, that helps their pocketbooks, but also helps the environment, can win even under difficult political circumstances. But it's going to take all of the substantive, the very substantial intellectual firepower of the folks in this room to help us get our minds around how to solve these problems, because we face massive headwinds on the political side, and they are only helped along when our infrastructure fails, and it seems to prove the point of the naysayers and the deniers and the folks who stand to gain by shutting down the climate agenda and defending the status quo and the legacy industries that have made so much money off of polluting our planet.
From my perspective, all the interventions that we're talking about to respond to climate change really come down to supporting nature. And unless people believe that nature is important and they value that, then we're not going to succeed. And so when I think of our tribal friends and colleagues who talk about, we are part of nature, biodiversity really is nature, and we can't be separated from it. And biodiversity exists everywhere. And so we can't save 100% of biodiversity by setting aside 30% of our land. So what does that mean? The rest of the 70%, what are we going to do there? And that is going to include working lands, urban biodiversity. It's going to be efforts where we can get young people to start to have agency and to see themselves in nature, to belong, to be part of nature, to care about nature. We have to start at the very earliest of ages and build that sense of agency all the way through, all through education and in our society. I mean, it really boils down to, if people care and understand about the intrinsic value of nature and why it's important to their own survival, and in all different ways, then that will give us the best hope of implementing change. People will demand the change because they want to support nature, because nature is our own life support system. And that, I think, is what we risk if we don't invest in developing that support and understanding across our society. Then we risk failure. So I feel that is a risk that we have. We need to help people understand why it's important to support nature.
Thank you. I'm going to make one more round of questions from here on the stage before opening it up. So in about 5 minutes, we'll invite you all to queue up at the microphone. My final question, right? We are sitting before an audience of predominantly researchers, which include both academics and their community partners of the UC Climate Change Action Initiative, funded so generously by the legislature and the governor a few years ago, and dreamt up by the UC Vice President, Dr. Maldonado, and her counterparts at CSU and Governor's Office of Planning and Research under Nguyen Taraki. What would you have researchers do to help progress California's climate goals? Very practical call to action. What would it be?
Quickly continue our collaboration, but double down on it because the challenges are that much more now. So keep going what we're doing, sort of collaborating at so many different levels in terms of research, because that's the foundation for solutions. So continue on that. Let's double down on that and look for more opportunities in that space.
Ditto, with a focus on nature-based solutions and solutions that we have not yet tackled, that may be from voices who are underrepresented.
Let me start by just saying how much I personally appreciate the incredible research that we get out of the University of California and other great institutions. It's helped to inform my work in the legislature and so many of my colleagues. Everything from firefighting foam for firefighters and learning about studying the carcinogens and alternatives that we could utilize. Just this last week, I was at UCLA at a round table of brilliant professors who were all studying various aspects of the fire response. Everything from law and what do we do with insurance issues and mortgage, right the way over to financing mechanisms, the rebuild, air quality issues, fire resiliency and science. So the intellectual and academic and research firepower of the university can and must be so helpful to us, and it's part of that's part of the sacred trust we have, and part of I think how we continue to justify funding the UC. And someone who wants to see more money for the UC, I want to see more of that dialogue and back and forth and assistance and support. I guess my call to action, I am the elected official, so I keep talking about politics. Don't forget politics. All the research is fantastic. We know, but we also have seen that no matter what information is put out there, credible, data-based, research-based, infallible science, it still gets torn to shreds in the meat grinder of the American political conversation. And so the more you can take into account, the more you can make your stories, your research relatable and connectable to everyday people. Try to spend as much time as you can when you go home for Easter, or Passover, or Thanksgiving, to explaining what you do to your grandma and your mom and your cousin and your kids. Think about how to make your work relatable to folks who don't have your expertise. I had a great conversation with a researcher last night who does work on cash for clunkers and all the pollution associated with older generation gas vehicles. And he made the point, I didn't even really know this, but that it would actually, the best thing you could do for the environment when you buy a new gas car is to drive it to the scrapyard and scrap it and buy an electric car, which really counters the narrative of a lot of people that are trying to attack the EV industry. And he said that literally from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, there's so much pollution that the gas vehicles create that it's still all the problems with the EVs and the lithium batteries and the disposal, it still doesn't outweigh the negatives associated with gas vehicles. And we've got into a really great conversation. How does he get the word out, and how reach out to journalists? Think about ways to expand your message beyond just climate to talk about air pollution and public health and air quality. Figure out ways to talk about affordability. So I just ask you to try to think about how to relate your incredibly important research to through a public dissemination lens.
I think that our scientists are doing a fantastic job, and I am surrounded by so many people who do their work because they believe that science should be done in service to society. And so I would urge you to continue to think about solutions. Have a solutions mindset for your research. We have critical problems that need your science. And I would just say this, someone said it earlier today, than ever. Be brave. Keep your head down. Keep going forward, because this stuff will pass. Again, knowledge will set us free in the long run, but we can't stop. Basically, this track of solutions, we're doing so well. We've made tremendous progress. Don't let this noise on the outside stop you from doing the work that you're doing.
I want to go work for the university. You're living a happier life than I'm living. I got to tell you. Yeah, all right.
And with that, I would like to invite anyone from the audience to please queue up at the microphone for any questions that you might have for the panel. And in the meantime, I'll share a phrase I've heard just recently, is that hope is the pretty face of fear. What the world needs more of is courage, right? And I see California leaders stepping up again and again in that vein. So truly, thank you for being such extraordinary representatives. So we'll spend the next about 15 to 20 minutes with audience questions. I would love for you to introduce yourself, and please avoid making comments and really limit to questions for our panels. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sarwat Chaudhry. I work at UC Irvine at the Wildland Urban Interface Climate Action Network. I'm here with my PI, Steve Ellison, and we were in a couple of panel discussions before. So, I've been listening to the 2 days deliberation, really interesting discussion. So when we were talking about climate action, I was, because in my previous life, before coming to California, I used to work for the United Nations in different countries. And as we know, like circular economy is very close to the climate action work. And I was wondering about that. So I'm really glad that Secretary Van Allen mentioned circular economy, and also that the extended producer responsibility work in South Korea. When I left in 2021, the recycling rate was over 70%. Yeah. And California, as we are saying, it's the 5th largest economy in the world, right? So as we are talking about the LA fires and rebuilding, right? It's like, during COVID, we were saying build back better. So I was thinking, how we can focus on this, kind of resilient rebuilding, looking into this kind of sustainable circular economy concepts. And also another idea I wanted to suggest is the volume-based fee system, which is also like extended producer responsibility. This is on the producer side for the companies, right? But on the consumer side, also the volume-based waste fee system automatically makes you, it penalizes you if you're producing waste, right? So this is kind of this concept of sustainable production and consumption, which I see in California, but it's not stringently being applied. So while we are talking about rebuilding LA and, and as we are moving forward, I think this is something we should consider hand in hand. And yeah, if you have any suggestions on how we can make a statewide practice. Thank you.
Senator Allen, you want to start us off here?
Yeah, obviously we need behavioral shift. I go to place. It's amazing how hard it's been to convince people that this is something that people will actually are able to do. Oh, it's cultural. We can't make the change. You go up to places like Vancouver, which has people from all over the world, incredible diversity in that town, and yet you see all these nice, Canadians and naturalized Canadians just all bringing their, sorting their items, and it's a very efficient system, not a perfect system, but much better than ours. And so we've tried to take inspiration from these other places, but really force the industry to be part of the solution and say to them, look, you have the tools at your disposal. You have the most control over your products. You understand your markets. You understand your consumers the most. You need to play a role in helping to produce products that are more recyclable, compostable, reusable. You need to play a role in reducing the amount of waste that you put out onto the market. So that's the idea, that's the concept. We know that there are other places that have done it successfully. We just need to push the culture in a way. And I'm just hopeful, we're running into some headwinds on 54 implementation. A lot of people from industry just don't want to see, they're just kind of foot dragging a little bit, quite frankly. This is just one of the challenges we're always facing. How do we just push the status quo? Because there's so much built-in inertia. because inertia benefits the folks that are making money now, and the people who are making money now have the money to influence the political process now. So, this is why we just need resolve and courage and all the things we've been talking about to just keep pushing forward. But I am very optimistic that the model and the framework that we have with SB 54 is going to realize the very vision that you've described. And that's ultimately going to be a critical partnership with the California Environmental Protection Agency, which oversees CalRecycle, that will be implementing this really important program.
Yeah, I think just to put a really fine point on I think what is the beauty of our extended producer responsibility programs, and that is upstreaming that responsibility. So we're actually not looking, we're acknowledging the fact that consumers and residents often don't have an option. And it shouldn't be them who are penalized for the fact that producers of plastics, in the plastics example, are only producing plastic products to put into the consumption stream. That squarely belongs with those producers. And I think the extended producer responsibility regulations being implemented is going to be quite uncomfortable for industry. And we've already seen what that means in terms of the narrative that this will, affect every Californian's pocketbook. Well, that is a choice that is squarely made by the producer. So if producers choose to transfer that cost onto the consumer, that is a choice made by the producer. And so I think one of the things that we need to continue to debunk are those types of impacts that come not just from an extended producer responsibility reg, but how that producer chooses to comply with it. And then I think in terms of tethering this to research, there's obviously a lot moving in the recycling space, and not all forms of recycling are created equal. And it will be critically important to have genuine access to transparent information about the impacts associated with some types of recycling. And that requires, as researchers and as experts in these fields, a very acute and precise awareness of what the unintended impacts could be downstream from a waste standpoint, from an air quality standpoint, a health and OSHA standpoint in terms of worker safety, et cetera. And so I thank you all in advance and currently for the work that you're already involved in this space, and know that it will be a growing space where we really need to continue to focus on the environmental stewardship that drove our implementation of these laws in the first place.
Thank you. Just wanted to quickly mention, the supply chain issues. Now we talked about batteries and EV, solar panels, and the batteries, the minerals like cobalt is coming from DRC. That also has human rights issues, implications, right? So that's why reducing consumption also, kind of has this global supply chain impact. Thank you so much.
Hi, I have a question for Senator Allen. And so actually I have two questions, I lied. And they're both kind of what creative things do you hope that your colleagues in the Senate and Assembly do about two things? One is, we know that we're gonna need a lot of shifts, both at the local and state level, not just to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but to support our communities who are going to be harmed by the climate change that is to come. And we know that part of that is going to be building up community organizing, community infrastructure, and political infrastructure. So what creative ways that you're not already doing, so not the 40% going to EJ communities, could you imagine your colleagues supporting the development of community organizing around climate issues? And then the second question is, what ways could you imagine your colleagues sort of standing up to the fossil fuel industries that have really created this problem and getting them to do things like, pay reparations for what just happened in LA?
Yeah. Well, on the second question, there's already couple really important initiatives that have been put forward by a couple of my colleagues. Carol Menjivar from the San Fernando Valley's put forward a bill, a polluter pays bill, and Senator Wiener's put forward a bill giving a right of action, a private right of action for folks to sue fossil fuel companies, victims of climate-related disaster, to sue fossil fuel companies for the whatever whatever they're not being compensated for, either through insurance or FEMA. So there is an appetite. Whether these bills are going to make it is another story. But I think it's demonstrative of the frustration and the resolve that exists amongst a number of my colleagues to start pushing the envelope on these things. I think on the organizing side, it's a great question. There's some wonderful there's really good work happening. Environmental justice organizations. Yana spent some time working in that field. She can probably speak more to it. You see them teaming up a lot now, more than ever before, with some of the more traditional mainstream environmental organizations, like the former League of Conservation Voters now, which is Environmental Voters, and Sierra Club, and some of those other groups as well, Natural Resources Defense Council. I think the answer, are my colleagues open to it? Depends on the colleague, depends on their politics. I will say that, that certainly people on the Democratic side are very concerned about losing working people. We've seen this real hemorrhage in the last election. And so work that is underway to help engage working people in the climate justice struggle is an important thing. It's both important substantively and politically.
Just quickly to add your question about the organizing part of it, just from a government perspective, I think there's two critical issues, at least from our perspective. One is you have to have the people at the table, at the decision-making table. We're intentional when we hire people that lived experiences should be actually on the other side. So we get a lot of people from the organizing community. There's a little adjustment that takes place when you're now on the other side, but that is really critical. People have to be either politically engaged and or be at the decision-making table. The second part of it is, again, from government perspective. A lot of our programs that I mentioned, whether it's TCC or regional resiliency program or local program, we built into the criteria that organizing is critical. We require that you partner with normally people you don't partner with. That process that they go through, not only grant application process, but once they're granted to actually deliver the work, really builds capacity around organizing. So that is a critical part of it, sort of real world examples. There are a number of them in some of our programs that we have seen. TCC, I mentioned, is one of them. They become not only organizers, but actually politically engaged once they see the results of what comes out of that process.
Thank you so much for your question. With 10 minutes remaining of our Q&A, with 6 people left in the queue, I suggest we go into a lightning round, where we spend 90 seconds per question. You have 20 seconds to ask, and we have 70 seconds to respond. Are you up for it?
I'll try.
We'll practice that science communication principle in action right now.
Politicians and scientists, I don't know.
Thank you.
No one's concise.
I do want to follow up on your what you said, that it's so important for the messaging and communication, especially in this day of misinformation. And should research grants that are going to scientists perhaps require a bigger percent of resources to go to communication? Like, what's the balance? And I agree, we need more of that. So.
It's a great question. I mean, the challenge, you obviously can't have government grants going toward things that are too political, but of course, I mean, communications has to be a part of this process. It's a public education that's grounded in the science that you're trying to fund in the first place is a totally legitimate expenditure. So that's it's a good point. We'd have to figure out how to do that. Maybe that's why we have our administration folks. But I love that idea, actually, if we could find a way to do that effectively.
I mean, USDA has had programs in the past where 30% of grants have to go to extension, for example, beyond just research.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. It's a great point.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Greg Macy, UC Irvine. I'm here with Integrated and Equitable Climate Action with Alejandro Camacho, also with We Can with Steve Allison and Sarwat and others. So you have a captive audience. We look tired, but that's just because we've been passionately talking for 2 days. We're mobilized, we're energized, we're in it for the long haul. We're going to triple down, God willing. But what we don't have is what you all have on the stage, which is situational awareness. Right? So I'm interested, maybe if each of you can quickly speak to this. where are the threats to California's leadership? And this could be other states, this could be other parts of the world, in terms of climate action, and in particular in terms of frontline communities. It could be a policy innovation somebody else has gotten to first. It could be we got there first, but we're implementing and we're doing it in a way that's less than satisfying. Where do you see the threats to leadership? Because we want to help you maintain that leadership over the next 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see a couple of threats that are uniquely Californian. One is our water supply and just the heavy rains and the hard droughts that we get. If we can figure out how to meaningfully leverage the wet weather, which we do right now through groundwater recharge, which is amazing, but we need a whole lot less chemicals and contaminants in our soils if we're going to easily recharge all of our groundwater aquifers for use at future dates. So that's one that is uniquely Californian. I think the other is, leveraging the power of industry. I talked a lot about our public-private partnerships. I think we have some really successful partnerships with auto manufacturers. Historically, that has always also been the case. They can also be a wild card and align themselves sometimes with some of the red states in ways that are less productive for our work moving forward. So I think that's another area where, auto use and manufacturing, maybe weaning ourselves off of so much reliance on automobiles, period, is something that we ought to think about. And then the final one that I'll mention is our reliance on chemicals, chemical-based products, particularly in food production. And our food production, our food supply in California is just incredible. We are so lucky to be the hub of this type of food production, but it does not come without its own costs. And so that's another area that I think we need a lot of innovation and a lot of activity to make sure that we can build a resilient agricultural economy and food supply.
Hi, Nathan Van Schmidt, Climate Science Director with San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory. There's been a lot of talk about the importance of bringing in working class people, and obviously since the 1970s, 1980s, when the approach of environmental science was very top-down regulation, we've seen a huge effort towards things like Sustainable Growth Council, where we're doing science with communities. As scientists, how can we adapt this? Because during that time, it feels like there's been, if anything, more hostility and vitriol increasing in recent years towards our work. How can we engage with communities in this increasingly polarized climate?
I would just say that we're, in terms of, I can't see you, in terms of biodiversity, for example, we have to rely on community science as one example. I think bringing science to the communities is going to be really important for providing data to communities and regions so that folks can look at the data and make their own decisions for their own context. I think that's very important. I think demystifying the science and translating it into products that are actually useful for decision making is another way that we can build some agency with folks. So I think ultimately, it was about the communications question, is once you have the science, how do you translate that into something that's meaningful for people in communities in different sectors? So I think that's part of the idea. Make it relevant, make it solutions oriented, and I think that's the way you get confidence from folks. The science will matter for them.
And work with existing networks of community-based organizations who are trusted communicators within their community. Like, I think that's the big thing. There are communicators within any community that are already the kind of go-to messengers. I think making sure that you're also working with them so that there is that trusted voice to understand what it is you're saying and sharing is also important.
Hi. Okay, so 20 seconds is really hard for me as a Native woman, but I'm gonna try, okay? Usually not very concise or fast. But anyway, thank you for being here. My name is JC Bowles. I'm a community researcher in Oakland, California. And thanks. Shouts out. But anyway, so what our organization, our project, which is funded by UCLP, we cultivate research skills within our youth along the 880 corridor, right? And so some of the hardest impacted communities in Oakland. And so one of the things that we use, and because we're in a research setting, we use imaginative inquiry with them, right? And so we ask them to go to the limits of their imagination. If they had all green lights, what would Oakland look like for you? And so what we do with that is we say your reality is shaped by the capacity of your imagination, the limit or the lack thereof. And so when I see you all up here, and I understand that you are both in a position of influence, right, but also your imagination shapes your reality, it shapes the reality of Californians. And so I know it's a lightning round, and so I'm thinking, at the limits of your imagination, if you had all green lights, which you won't in the next 4 years, lucky you, right? What is one thing that you are like, if I had all green lights, this would be a success. This is what I would change in California. Or if there's a couple of things that you can get in 90 seconds, so.
I'll just start with a very on-the-ground example of East Oakland. And I think that is just simply increasing green space for schools in particular. And this is something that we've focused on quite a bit through our California Climate Investments programs. We've worked with folks like the Green Schoolyards to make sure that we're even just providing tree canopy or green space for any of our school children, particularly in places like East Oakland along the 880 corridor. And I think that has shown in terms of co-benefits. I mean, it shows climate resiliency, but it's also extraordinarily helpful for mental health. I mean, so many of our kids, particularly in places in Oakland, are growing up without green space and access to nature, period. And so making sure that if I had one small green light for Oakland in particular, and maybe just East Oakland, it would be greening every single school and making sure that every student has access to nature and green space in their day-to-day interaction.
Thank you.
I agree what she said.
I'll take you up on that. How about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would, gosh, I mean, you know, all these wonderful, aggressive environmental bills that I work on that would all pass with flying colors. We double, triple the amount of money to the University of California so that you can continue to do your work and expand it and do, but also not just the research you do, which is so important, but also the social mobility mission of the university, which provides so many opportunities for so many young people from all different backgrounds in the state, and it's really become such an important driver. My pet, love is for the state park system, which I think needs some TLC but a little bit of a kick in the pants to get more ambitious and really serve its great mission of love for nature, which is what we need so desperately in instilling in our next generation to succeed on all of our environmental goals.
Just to triple down, I would say access to nature early and often, but also mentoring and validating that is something that's worthwhile to do, so that young people see that being part of nature is something that they've baked into what they want to do for the rest of their lives.
That they belong to it, absolutely. Thank you. Would love to start there and work backward.
Go Oakland.
We could do it.
Hello, my name is Layla Scott. I am a non-potable water engineer from UC Santa Cruz. And
Go Slugs.
Go Slugs.
Go Slugs.
My question is California in a drought, or is California over-extracting? What is the panel's stance on certain water policy to restrict commercial companies' use of water for profits? Example could be mono agriculture, such as like pistachios, golf courses, and AI technology for cooling systems. When there's communities and ecosystems that do not have enough water to meet safe living demands. And what are some next steps California can do to increase water resilience and diversifying water sources?
All right, I think this one is for me. Unfortunately. Okay, so is a great series of questions. Both and in terms of, are we in cyclical droughts? Cyclical droughts are part of our historical weather patterns in the state of California. That is just a reality of our history as a state. We have also had a long history of extreme groundwater pumping that we know now needs to be better regulated for the protection of future generations and of all water users. The State Water Board has a number of pending processes to implement the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is really landmark piece of legislation that we are now in the active phase of enforcing. And it leads to some uncomfortable but very necessary conversations with community on the ground about what the future of water looks like in some of the most arid parts of our state. in terms of what we need to do moving forward, I think we need to continue to implement legislation like SGMA as transparently as possible, with as much planning ahead as we can to indicate what it means when we're no longer going to be pumping groundwater in the same way that we have been historically, what that means for communities, what it means for those who may have access to more water and those who may not. And in particular, we're talking about delivering drinking water to many communities who have not had access to drinking water historically in the state of California as well. But we also, again, need to diversify the way we even think about leveraging water supply in our state, period. And that includes a lot of new ways of considering water recycling methods, direct potable reuse, as I mentioned, and also, other forms of conventional recycling for drinking water purposes and non-drinking water purposes. But very complex set of questions, and happy to talk more. We could have talked for an hour and a half just on water. But yeah, I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you.
Lightning round. 10-second intro.
Oh gosh, I don't know if I can do that, but I'm gonna. Hi, my name is Linda Gordon. I'm from the UC Berkeley Human Rights Center. And my question is informed by the knowledge of academics, researchers, and community partners that have already been gutted by the federal administration in the last few weeks, both funding but also stripped of their safety and their ability to speak and publish and ensure their publications will remain online. And so I'm curious how you are connecting protections for academic institutions and researchers to climate action, how you see relationships between climate action and civil rights and human rights protections, and how you approach funding this work and ensuring that we as academic institutions are protected over the next 4 years.
And you're gonna take
God, what a sad thing that we have to ask that question, right? I mean, this is, and we've all lived through Democrat, Republican administrations. Never, if you'd asked that question, 20 years ago, it would have been, you would have seemed like some sort of fringe conspiracy theorist, and now it's so real. So look, I mean, it's one of the many things I think we just voted. We actually, as a state, we just put, I think, $50 million into legal defense efforts across the board for immigrants, for LGBT community, for our environmental efforts. I mean, a long range of different areas where the Trump administration is really attacking core California values. And I think this ought to be part of our work. And so I appreciate the question, and I'm actually going to do some follow-up to ensure that our Department of Justice and particularly our Department of Justice will spend some of those resources looking into defending the academy, defending your rights of academic freedom, and the sanctity of the intellectual process at our university. So I think it's a very worthy recipient of Department of Justice legal defense funds.
Yeah. I would only add to that last point, our research partnerships are not going away. And so we will continue in-house to need so many research partners and need authorship. And we are already in live conversations about changes in administration position on authorship for some of our federal agency partners and what that means. Not a very satisfactory answer, I think, at this moment, but all I can say is that we will maintain our commitment to making sure that those publications get out, whether they are under our seal or otherwise, and we'll continue our research partnerships, and thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone who asked a question. We dearly appreciate it. I realize we're already a minute after the hour, but if I might take just one more minute of privilege from the moderator's chair. From circular economy to science communication to desiloization to the value of coordination and understanding the system as a system with all of its moving parts to baseline tracking so we even know what impacts are ongoing and what we might need to address sooner than later. I appreciate you so very much for stepping up, for your generosity of time and expertise. I can't imagine a more appropriate closing panel for this two-day event. Thank you so much. If you'll welcome me in thanking the panel.